I'll request the participants to be seated, please. The next session is Energy Transition, Financing Equity and Global Cooperation. Please join me in welcoming the speakers. Mr. Nikhil Sawhney. Shri Prabhat Kumar Singh. Shri Prashant Kumar Singh. Dr. Angela Lugisi. Mr. Hari Bhaskar. Dr. Michael Greenstone. Mr. Ed Conway. Dr. Auguste Tano Kaume. May I request Mr. Sawhney to take over the conversation, please? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I know that we've had a very engaging couple of days with this economic conclave. I'd like to welcome everyone here this afternoon for what promises to be a very engaging discussion. The topic of ESG and environment and energy transition is always a matter where people have many, many opinions. And so we look forward to a very frank discussion with our panelists. We have 5 of them here and Ed, who is joining us virtually. And we have lots to discuss here. The topic, of course, is on financing, global cooperation, and equity. But there are many areas which will fall in between that as well. And when we look at a country like India, which has huge aspirations in terms of increasing its income, but also the aspirations for higher energy consumption, we need to see how those would be met both technologically, as well as how they would be executed on the ground on the financing with the availability. We have, the metrics are known to most of you. We have, India is now the 3rd largest renewable energy producer globally, and a lot of credit has to go to the government of India and the vision of the Prime Minister here. But it is the future. It is a secular trend for us to invest increasingly more into our renewable assets. But this is a story which is equally the same for other developing countries, but also for developed countries. This transition is truly a democratic process which everyone has to undergo. The only issue will be the timelines by which we implement it. So we have, again, as I said, a very engaging panel here. I would like to begin with asking the panelists for some introductory remarks, following which we would take up some questions. And I would encourage the members of the audience to keep their questions ready. We would take them at one point in time and present them to the panelists. So first, I'd like to start with Secretary Mr. P.K. Singh. If you'd like to address us from the podium or from your seat, I'll leave it to you. Over to you.
Thanks, Nikhil. Good afternoon, everybody. Distinguished dignitaries both on and off the dais, ladies and gentlemen. It's always exciting to talk about the wonderful RE journey that India is presently undergoing. There's been a very clear message that RE has arrived. I mean, it's go from strength to strength from here. If you just look at the capacities, as Nikhil rightly mentioned, a few days back we became the 3rd largest RE producer in the world, bypassing Brazil. We are also the 3rd largest solar, we've harnessed solar, we're the 3rd largest. We just overtook Japan a few months ago. The best part is that if you look at the last 10 years, maybe last 10, 12 years, the growth has been phenomenal, be it solar, be it wind, be it bioenergy, and the latest kid on the block is green hydrogen. As I mentioned, It's a very challenging task that has been set before us. The announcement made by the Honorable Prime Minister is 500 gigawatt by 2030. Today we are at 214, if I include 9 gigawatt of nuclear. We have come a long way. We have tripled our RE capacity in the last 10 years. We just need to take it forward from here. There are challenges, no doubt, as in any other rising sector. The challenges are related to finance. Our requirement is close to 30 lakh crore, which translates into, I think, $300 billion plus. There is requirement of manpower, trained manpower, not only for us, but to meet the global requirement as well. There are challenges of land. There's also challenges of transmission. Now, we are completely seized of the issue, but more importantly, our stakeholders are very excited. The industry is very excited. We have to touch multiple stakeholders. The industry is there. The central government departments are there. The state governments are there. Everybody has a very vital role to play in the overall growth story. When we look at financing, we see that over the last 10 years, it's been mostly debt, about 70%, equity being only 30%. But looking at the requirement, we are trying to explore every possible mean that is available to us at the moment. The first and foremost things which I talk in every forum is perhaps, we need to look at us first. And there has to be a solid change in mindset. All along for the last 50 years, we have been just thinking of power, of thermal power, big plants. The time has now come for distributed RE, for produce and consume it there itself, limit the requirement of transmission lines, because the way it is growing, you need to deal with the intermittency also. And when I talk of intermittency, the first thing that comes to my mind is battery. And let me tell you, ladies and gentlemen, today we are at just 230 megawatt of battery storage. By the year 2030, we'll be almost at 230 gigawatt hour. So that is the scale that we are talking about. Come 2025, and we'll see it on the ground. Battery storage is going to come up in a big way. It is logical also. It is pretty encouraging to see the battery prices falling the way they are. Pump storage is again one area to make it the curve more smooth. But allow me just half a minute for green hydrogen. This is something where I think you touched the international collaboration part as well. This is an area which is again what solar used to be about 15 years ago. People used to say that this can never happen. At least to the level it has happened today. This is something which will take time. It may take about maybe 2 years to mature. But then we all need to pool our resources. India, all the other countries. There's no need to reinvent the wheel. We need to put our, not whole of government approach, whole of world approach on this. Because this is going to be the fuel of the future. It may just take some time. Today we are talking of $5-6 a kg. And the day it comes to about $2.50, I think the day would have arrived. But today, as we work very relentlessly for promoting green hydrogen, we are also looking at creating demand. How best because demand is going to be the biggest driver. The moment you see the industry sees demand, firm demand coming up, people will line up, there will be things happening. Of course, today we are doing all the pilots, we are considering all the hard to abate sectors. Things have already started on the ground. So it's a very encouraging sector, I must say. But coming to the change in mindset, there is a requirement of MNRE, the Ministry of New and Renewable Energy, to take a lead in this. All the planners, unfortunately, happen to be on the Ministry of Power side. We need to discuss with them. It is strange that, I was just joking with somebody that the member NRE on CEA is not an RE man. That is something which is not acceptable. It has to be an RE man. Perhaps CEA should also be with us. We need to now plan from here on. In the last, 8 years, about 25 gigawatt of thermal has been added, and about 100 gigawatt of RE has been added. So that is a signal. I think it is now high time that we realize we need to put a separate spectacle. As you know, when you go for an eye test, they try different lenses. The vision is getting blurred now. You need to put a lens in front of you, an RE lens, and see it from that perspective. The growth is going to be phenomenal. What we just aspire for is keep regulations simple, work at speed, and work at scale. And I'm sure the targets are very easy to achieve. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Secretary. And you bring up very interesting points. The fact that there are challenges, but there's been huge accomplishments by the country is true testimony to the work and priority that we're giving. Of course, there is a need to give even greater priority and shift in mindset. With that, I'd like to move to Michael, Dr. Greenberg. Could I request you have a presentation, I believe, and if you'd like to address us from the podium, I'd leave that to you.
Okay, it's a great honor to be here on such a distinguished panel. And I believe there'll be some slides coming up in a minute. Like magic. There we go. Okay, so what I wanted to talk to you, so I misread the email. I was told that I had an hour and 15 minutes and I could use 232 slides. So I will try to skim it down a little bit and stick roughly within the guidance. So what I wanted to talk about, I thought setting the stage might be useful, is what I think of as the global energy challenge, and it's captured in these two pictures here. And I think too often in the world we have people who are in a very isolated way only focused on energy prices and economic growth, or only focused on environmental considerations as documented in this picture here. But what the global energy challenge is something that every society faces, and it will require every society to find the right balance between the need for economic growth and environmental quality that directly affects human well-being, just like economic growth does. And so I thought I would illustrate this. I think everyone here kind of instinctively knows this, and here's some pictures that maybe help drive it home. So this is on the horizontal axis. There's total energy consumption per person, and on the vertical axis, there's per capita GDP. And the thing that only thing I want you to take away from it is how tight of a relationship there is. And so whatever version you have of society, India being an important one, becoming wealthier, it's going to have to involve more energy consumption. We have no historical examples of societies achieving high levels of living standards without consuming lots and lots of energy. So the first goal in the Global Energy Challenge is how to make sure that every society has access to inexpensive and reliable energy. The second goal is clean air, and the reason I'm putting this up kind of at the same level that you would think about energy consumption, energy prices, is that the energy choices that we make influence the amount of air pollution we have. They're inextricably linked. And you can see here is a map using some work that we've been doing at the University of Chicago, developing something called the Air Quality Life Index. And it's the gain in life expectancy at 25,000 regions around the world. In the India case, it's at the district level. If air quality moved into compliance with WHO standards. And so you can see that the air pollution problem is concentrated in particular parts of the world. India is an important one. And there are really substantial improvements in life expectancy that are available in the name of, or that would be unlocked with policies that are able to reduce air pollution. And then the third goal, which is also linked to our energy choices, that the same energy choices that affect that have prices attached to them and affect the air pollution we get also can involve CO2 or not, the release of CO2 or not, no release of CO2 from the zero carbon energy sources. And these are the damages that we can expect as a percentage of GDP at the end of the century, assuming temperatures go up by about 3 degrees C by the end of the century. And what's striking to me is both the level of them in some parts of the world, but how different they are. And you can see there's vast stretches of the world where it will get better, and that's because the winters will get less harsh. But along the equatorial region where places are already hot and often not very wealthy, you can see there's going to be lots of damages. And of course, if migration were feasible, free migration were feasible, we just have a lot of people move to the blue areas. I don't think necessarily a lot of people in the area would be very excited about moving to northern Russia. And I'm not sure northern Russians would be super excited about having lots of migrants. And so so we're going to have to find some way to manage that. So the point of the global energy challenges is that in making our energy choices, we are choosing three different things. We're choosing the price, we're choosing the amount of air pollution we're going to face and the amount of climate change that we're going to face. And every society is going to have to find some way to balance them. So what I thought I would talk about is some work that we've been doing at the University of Chicago in India, and that aims to find a good balance between these goals. I should just back up. This is done through EPIC India, the Energy Policy Institute of Chicago in India, which has been working for the last decade in India, and here's a listing of some of the places and projects. These are some of our partners, government organizations and NGOs and private companies, and this is a summary of some of what we've accomplished in the last decade. But I really want to draw your attention to one project in particular in the state of Gujarat, in Surat, where we ran a pilot pollution market, or cap and trade. And the idea there was, can we find a policy that allows economic growth to flourish while also making progress against the air pollution problem? And this was done, this was led obviously by the Gujarat Pollution Control Board, and there's a series of other collaborators listed here. Importantly, this pilot was run as a genuine experiment where half of the plants were assigned to this new pollution market. Those are the orange ones in this cartoon here. And half continued to be regulated in the status quo way. And so then we were able to, and because they were assigned randomly, we were able to compare their outcomes across the two groups. What I want you to take away is that in the market, the compliance costs for industry went down by about 11%. And industry was able to take advantage of that by expanding operations, having higher profits, and furthering economic growth, all the good things. By switching from the clunky regulation or command and control regulation, this was able to foster economic growth. Now, what was the impact on the environment? What was really striking is that at the same time, emissions went down by 20 to 30%. And this is largely because the Gujarat Pollution Control Board was now able to get plants to comply with the rules using a market which was not, they were much more effective at it in the market than in the status quo. So why am I telling you about this? That's just one industrial agglomeration in one city in Gujarat. Well, this was, as I said, it was run as a pilot. The Gujarat Pollution Control Board was so taken with the results. They have expanded the size of that market in Surat. They've created a new market in Ahmedabad. They have other markets coming. The neighboring state of Maharashtra was so excited by this that they have now issued a notification and they are launching a sulfur dioxide market. And so the theme I want to communicate is, yes, we have this very difficult balancing act that defines the global energy challenge. But I think often we think of technology and mandates as a way forward. There are, I think, a lot of opportunity for testing new policies and using market-based policies to find the right balance between the important needs and aspirations for economic growth with the equally important environmental goals. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Michael. And that was, it seemed like there was much more content on your slide. So unfortunately, we didn't have time to go through it. But if it's available for people here, we'd very much like to get access to it at some point. And it's very interesting how market-driven solutions have been able not only to lower costs, but demonstrably lower emissions and other outcomes. So it's possibly a route that we should use for other markets such as carbon, et cetera, which provide us a great degree of confidence. But before we come to some of those questions in the question and answer session, and you told me this is your 30th visit to India. So, so that's a great, thank you very much, and thank you for focusing on such a sensitive topic. We have Ed joining us from what I presume would be England right now. Ed, over to you for your introductory remarks.
Thank you, Nikhil, and it's a great honour to be appearing there. I'm sorry that it's a remote appearance. I would much love to have been there in person. We just had a baby very recently, so I'm staying in the country for the time being. I think if there's any expertise I could add to this, I mean, I'm a writer and a journalist. Cards on the table there. I'm not an economist or indeed a politician, or for that matter, an engineer or a business person. But I suppose if I have some perspective on this, it's I recently wrote this book called Material World. I try in my work to straddle those sectors in an effort to get a more holistic view. As Michael was alluding to a moment ago, sometimes, often actually, economists either ignore energy and climate, or they try to kind of clunk it into their models. We need to try to mainstream this. You know, when we're talking about energy, when we're talking about climate, everyone needs to be talking about this because it is such an enormous issue. But I think if there's anything else I can bring to this, it's that in my position, you sometimes become familiar with the gap between the conventional wisdom of the challenges that we're faced with and then the reality. And I think that gap is very big at the moment. Certainly in my country and in Europe, and to some extent elsewhere as well. And the scale of that challenge that most of our countries have set ourselves, net zero, you know, this is the single biggest challenge, I believe, that we have committed to as a species, potentially, full stop. And that's for 4 reasons, really. First of all, we're replacing highly dense, energy-dense fuels with much less energy-dense fuels. So we're going from fossil fuels, which are you know, very good at what they do in terms of providing a certain amount of energy in a certain weight or space, and we're going to sources of energy and power that are much less energy dense. That's a challenge. It's not an insurmountable challenge, but it's nonetheless a challenge. We're going down the kind of thermodynamic ladder, which is a big deal. Secondly, we are aiming to try and achieve this transition faster than any previous transition has been achieved in history. Again, not insurmountable, and you can find various different examples of micro transitions that have been achieved quickly, but the scale of this is absolutely enormous, and the speed at which we're intending to do it is absolutely rapid and unprecedented. And then the third challenge, or the third reason why this is such an enormous challenge, is that in order to get to that point, we have to rethink a lot of old industrial processes that we haven't really rethought for a long time. And, you know, Nikhil, you'll be kind of intimately familiar with this. You know, when you're thinking about how things are made, a lot of those processes, whether it's blast furnaces or basic oxygen converters or electric arc furnaces, or even the Czochralski process, which we use to create those silicon wafers that become solar panels and silicon chips, these processes are mostly very old. You know, they're 100 years old in many places. We haven't really had to rethink them for a long time just because they are really efficient at what they're doing. However, they are often very kind of carbon intensive. So we have to rethink them. And that involves having to conduct essentially a new industrial revolution, which is both an enormous challenge, but also an opportunity. But the scale of it, I think, is sometimes underestimated. And I think the fourth and final reason why this is such a big deal and so tricky is that we don't really have that much experience within humankind at all of actually shuttering old mining industries. I've been very struck by the fact that when we have energy transitions, we kind of just layer the new fuel on top of the last one. It's not like we just throw away our coal mining industries. And so trying to do that this time around, again, it certainly might be doable. It's just not something we have that much experience of doing. We're still mining, you know, enormous amounts, for instance, of asbestos and various other substances which, you know, in Europe and the US are banned. So we still carry on doing a lot of the mining. I think another thing I'd just echo, you know, that I think perhaps Michael was talking about as well is just the importance of energy. You know, a lot of the pathways for net zero seem to kind of forget that, you know, economic activity is a form of energy conversion. And a lot of those pathways to get to net zero, those net zero pathways seem to assume that final energy demand, and this is after you account for the losses when you're kind of burning something. So it's not primary energy, it's final energy. A lot of those pathways assume that final energy demand is basically going to be flattish or falling. And that would seem to me to be incompatible with a lot of the past experience of how economic growth happens. Economic growth involves a lot of energy. We want to do that energy cleaner, but we don't want to demonize energy. And that seems pretty important to me. And certainly in Europe, I mean, I think some people equate energy as being a bad thing. It's not necessarily. I think there's another thing which I just raised quickly, which is to say that there's kind of an equity and a fairness issue as well. So one of the points that I make in my book, Material World, is that one helpful prism through that you can look at the world through is not GDP per capita, but look at different countries in terms of their steel per capita. I know that sounds probably strange at first, but if you think about it, steel and iron is actually quite a useful proxy for living standards. So, you need steel to make hospitals, to make schools, to make public transport or high-speed rail systems, hydroelectric dams, wind turbines. It all uses an enormous amount of steel. And so you get a pretty good sense of the development level of a country by looking at how much steel there is in stock, so embedded within that economy. And if you look at Europe and the US, we're talking about 15 tons of steel per capita. If you look at India, I mean, this is a few years ago, but the statistics suggested it was just below 1 ton per capita. And if you look at some parts of sub-Saharan Africa, you're talking about barely 0.1 tons of steel per capita. And that's quite a profound difference. And obviously, that means in many parts of the world and in many parts of India, people do not have the living standards that they would rather like to achieve. And they don't have the high-speed rail systems, they don't have the hospitals and the schools, they don't have the cars, that they want. And there is a conundrum, I think, we have to grapple with, which is that people in sub-Saharan Africa and indeed in parts of India are completely entitled to expect living standards to rise to a similar level to what we have in Europe and what there is in the US. But so far there is still, and I really hope that the Secretary, his plans for green hydrogen bear fruit. But right now, there is no cheap way of mass producing a lot of virgin steel without a lot of carbon emissions. And so it's back to that industrial revolution point. How are we going to achieve that? How is the COP process for mitigation and adaptation going to allow for us to create all of that steel in a kind of sustainable, low carbon way? I don't think we have the answer, and I definitely don't think we yet have the finance for that. Or you could make the same kind of point about fertilizers. The final thing I'd just say is that a lot of what I've been talking about so far might seem like quite negative. I actually am very enthusiastic about this. This is a massive technological opportunity for the world to be able to rethink the way that we make stuff. And that is an amazing thing. How many of us, how many people get to live through an industrial revolution? We are living through one at the moment, and it's incredibly exciting. And I know it's exciting on the ground in India, another reason why I would much rather have been there than appearing virtually. But technology is coming to the rescue here to some extent. If you look at the latest estimates for how much gigafactory capacity and solar capacity is planned around the world right now, so existing and planned, it is actually more than we need to get to net zero across the world. So the capacity is coming. It's an extraordinary success story. I think, and some of it is obviously in India, and some of it is in other parts of Asia. But I think there's a pragmatic reality, and this is here where we get to the geopolitics, and I get a little bit more gloomy, which is that right now, a lot of that capacity, if not the vast majority of it, for solar and for batteries is in China. And I think the real question now is whether other parts of the world are happy for China to essentially provide the vast majority of batteries and solar panels to the world. And if they're not, what do they do? That's not clear, but we are going to have an interesting conversation about that in the next 4 years, especially given the incoming president of the United States. I see all of this as being a potentially exciting opportunity for India in particular, because if you have a world that's looking for alternative sources of all of this green tech, then India has an enormous opportunity there, given there is a kind of hegemon of this right so far. But I think it's going to be a bumpy road to get there. So bumpy, but exciting. And I'm mostly excited to see how this pans out. So thank you so much for allowing me to talk to you today.
Thank you very much, Ed. We missed you in India, but many congratulations on the birth of your child. The question that you brought up, there were two very interesting points that you brought up. One is on the reality of equity and the fact that you have a per capita energy consumption in India, which is of about 27 gigajoules which is 5 times less than China and about 10 times less than the United States. So not only does it present a challenge, the reality of the challenge of development, but the opportunity and the technological opportunity that countries like India and the rest have to build for themselves, because our requirements are going to be distinct to what may be required in a replacement market in Europe and the United States. But we have the next panelist, August, if I could request you to address us, either from your chair or from the podium.
Thank you, Harry. Thank you. Good afternoon, audience. It's really a pleasure to be here. I would like to thank the Confederation of Indian Industry and the Ministry of Finance for associating us, and it's really a pleasure to be part of this August panel. I'm asked to talk about a topic that is very close to my heart and very close to what we do at the World Bank. I would like to make basically 6 points. And I think I have 6 minutes or 7 minutes. The first point I would like to make is that energy transition is necessary, and it will buttress some of the things we've heard so far. The second is that there is a cost to it. It's not cost-free. But the third point is that there are a lot of benefits to it, perhaps even more than the cost. And I believe more than the cost, although data will tell. The fourth point I will make is that energy transition need not be additional to what we're spending already. It actually should substitute how we spend our monies today. And then I'd like to argue that, therefore, energy transition is actually economic transformation, perhaps an industrial revolution, as we heard from Professor Conway. And finally, I'll talk a bit about global cooperation and its role. So why is energy transition necessary? Well, take India. India's energy consumption per capita is 1/3 of the global average. India needs to grow to feed the largest population in the world. And that growth will come with more energy consumption. And if that energy consumption looks like what UK did, or what France did, or the US did when they were growing, we are all doomed. So we can't continue growing following the pattern of the old industrial revolution and using fossil fuel to power our growth. If we did that in India, it means 600 to 700 million people will still be vulnerable to adaptation, to resilience, to the impact of climate change. Do we want to do that? Do we want to grow while making our systems, our people, unsafe? Probably not. So we need to transform the energy matrix and the way we use energy to grow. So we don't blame energy, but energy needs to be cleaner. So it is absolutely necessary. The second reason why energy transition is necessary is that the market will tell us that they don't like us producing goods and services using fossil fuel. Our children are already telling us that. And in the future, the market, whether we transform or not, the market is going to stop buying things that are produced using mostly fossil fuel. So do we want an economy that is growing today and facing a wall tomorrow by not being able to sell its goods and services? No. So we need to transform now. The third reason why energy transition is necessary is because of energy security. Do we want to continue growing by importing fossil fuel for so much money? Probably not. India is spending 300 billion every year, according to some data, importing fossil fuel. So with energy transition, India can save up to 1% of GDP in trade balance. So it is really necessary for these reasons, and perhaps even more. But there is a cost to it. Transitioning is costly. It will require financing. According to some estimates, India will need to spend 600 billion to 1 trillion per year on its energy transition. This is a lot of money, and developing countries, low-income countries and low-middle-income countries as a group will need to spend more than 2 trillion a year on the energy transition. Almost half of that will be from India. There is also error. So energy transition is necessary, but it is costly. The good news is, and this is my third point, it has huge benefits. It will create new businesses. Those new businesses will create more jobs than the old one. Research shows that this will create more jobs than the old one. Research shows that green energy has a higher potential for creating jobs. Its job elasticity is higher than fossil fuel. India currently has about 5.6 million workers in the coal industry. Estimates suggest that when India does its transition by 2050, it will create an additional 56 million jobs. Who will give up on 56 million jobs by trying to cling on 5.6 million jobs? No one. So the benefits are huge, even for jobs. So let's think about the upside and the benefits for health. Air quality we saw earlier in the earlier presentation are huge. So with all these benefits, how do we think of financing the cost? And my argument is that the cost is not additional. We shouldn't be scared of the numbers that I gave you earlier in terms of cost. Because we're spending a lot of money already on investment. India spends about 30% of GDP on investment. Some of this investment can become greener. And as we transform them into greener investment, the additional cost will be less. And estimates suggest that instead of an additional 600 billion to 1 trillion, India may need to spend just 300 billion per year on the additional cost if we replace existing investment with greener investment. So it is affordable, it is doable, especially if we think of the benefits. And as we do that, as we think of the cost as not additional, but as a substitution of existing cost, then we start thinking of energy transition basically as economic transformation. It's basically transforming the way the economy creates jobs, transforming the way the economy invests, transforming the way the economy consumes. And when you do that, you start seeing benefits for even the trade balance, start seeing benefits for India's position in the global economy, becoming a leader of the energy, and becoming a producer for green energy for the world, and gaining a lot more benefits from it than being the third largest economy. So third largest economy, which transforms the rest of the world, will be more powerful than third largest economy that may be locked into goods and services that the world may not consume going forward. What does it mean for international cooperation? I see my time is up. International cooperation is very important. So if we stopped here, you may say, well, you know, the international cooperation doesn't have much to do. Countries need to transform the energy grid themselves, and they need to do it alone. I don't think that it is possible, because we're talking about a global public good, something that will benefit the world, and because there is an upfront cost, there is a role for global public financing to stimulate the upfront cost and the transition. So our role first, we could provide financing. In Baku at COP29, the MDBs, multilateral development banks, issued a statement committing to provide 120 billion of energy transition or climate finance by 2030, 100 billion per year by 2030. We already did very well. We exceeded our target for 2025 by 25%. So we showed that, you know, we can do more and we want to do more. And in the 120 billion that we hope to provide annually by 2030, 1/3 more or less would be for adaptation, 2/3 for mitigation, and we also hope to mobilize private financing. So our financing will bring private financing, and private financing will bring new access to new technology. And we'll also finance some of the cost of research and development or cost of failure for trying new things, will help encourage firms to take risks. So there is an agenda in front of all of us for international organizations to play. In addition to financing, we believe, and the statement that was put out says it very clearly, our biggest role is actually not in financing. It is to play a catalytic role so that our financing can come in and help the whole economy to transition its ways of spending, or its ways of investing, its ways of mobilizing financing, so that the whole thing is greener, so that our financing can stimulate economic transformation, not just energy transition. So, and finally, our contribution could also help close policy gaps, because there are areas where we need to think about some policies that may help communities support the transition better, or that will help firms invest more in the transition, or that will help the whole energy system itself to be resilient, to resist to the impact of its own created climate change. So there are some policies that we can help bring to bear in countries that are trying new things. And so we have a role to play, and I wanted to close by saying that if this is an industrial revolution, as Professor Conway said. I think we are in the middle of it. It's happening, and India is leading the charge. India has invested a lot in renewable, partly through its own financing, partly through international financing. We've worked with India in solar parks, and we have invested also in green hydrogen. So this transition, this revolution has started. It's taking place in India, and we would like to work with India to accelerate it so that India can lead the world in it. Thank you very much.
Thank you, August. Thank you for your vote of confidence, and thank you for laying the perspective of the fact that this transition is a transformation, and we have to view it as such. And there's no better segue to move to Angela, because when you did talk about the transformation of jobs and the potential of maybe 56 million jobs from the 5 million jobs that exist in the coal sector, I know that Angela has done a lot of work, and the UNDP has done a lot of work in places like Jharkhand on adaptation of jobs in that state and in other states. So we very much look forward to your introductory remarks, Angela.
Thank you very much. I'm from the United Nations Development Program, so of course I have to talk about people and development. So in 2015, when the world came up with the Sustainable Development Goals and also agreed on the Paris Agreement on Climate Change, we agreed that in order to achieve our development objectives, we were going to keep our emissions within the scope of raising temperatures only between 1.5 and 2 degrees centigrade. Now, we are way off track. And at that time, we had a limited carbon budget. And from all the indications we have now, if we continue at the rate of emissions that is happening right now, for example, this year, 2024, we are likely to go up by 0.8%. 2023, we went up by 1.4%. And if we continue using up the carbon budget that we have 50% chance to maintain within 1.5 to 2 degrees only for 6 years. So we are way, way off track when it comes to meeting our objectives. And this means that the transition from a fossil fuel economy to a more renewable-based economy is now more urgent than ever. And I also want to pick up on a point that was made about energy consumption. UNDP has a Human Development Index where we look at development in terms of not only income per capita, but also access to health and education. And we know there's a strong correlation between energy consumption and human development. And in order to achieve high human development, it's been shown that you would need to consume up to about 4,000 kilowatts per hour, per person, per year. That's 4,000. Most developed countries are already well beyond this level, but for most developing countries, they are way below this level. So if we're really thinking about advancing development, we also have to think in terms of how are we going to be able to achieve higher energy consumption without breaking our carbon budget. And this means that development is at risk. We still need to ensure that developing countries can meet their aspirations. And the only way this can happen is by decoupling economic growth from emissions. So this is really the direction of the future. But the good news is that, as was shared by the colleagues from renewable energy, the transition is already happening, and India is leading the way. There's strong and high level of commitments to coming up with 500 gigawatts by 2030, and we've heard that the progress is there. India is now the third largest installed capacity for renewable energy. We also heard about one of the largest places for solar energy, and the progress is really moving in the right direction. However, you'll all have heard about the outcome of COP29, where the sustainable financing that is required to meet this energy transition is a real concern. And I'd like to quote our UNDP administrator, who said at the conclusion of the COP that UNDP sees firsthand the climate ambitions of developing countries, including the mobilization of their own resources. Yet we remained concerned that despite their efforts, They face promises that are slow on delivery, growing debt burdens, and shrinking fiscal space to invest in their national priorities. So I'd just like to put on the table 3 things that really we need to put in mind if we need to advance this energy transition at the same time as we meet our development aspirations. First, we already know the benefits from transitioning from fossil fuels, and thank you so much, Auguste, for raising that. But we also must address the social costs. In the case of India, we need to have a comprehensive assessment of the social costs that are associated with a coal phase out or a coal phase down. We must understand the strengths, the aspirations, and the limitations of the human and social capital that is present for communities along the coal value chain. We also need to provide alternative livelihood opportunities and reskilling so that workers who are impacted by the transition have a way out. So this, it means that you have to come up with alternative investment plans and to provide decent work and quality jobs. So that's number 1. Secondly, we must embed the imperative of a transition in our policies and laws, because transitioning away from fossil fuel will need some critical legislation, policies and regulations. And as was mentioned, UNDP has been proud to partner with the government of Jharkhand, which has been leading the way and has come up with a Just Transition Task Force, who are looking at a critical roadmap and a vision for this just energy transition. And they're doing it with a structured dialogue, working across society to come up with this approach. And then the third point is that, as was mentioned, we need to ramp up both domestic and international financial flows for materializing this transition. For the domestic public finance, it's important to look at a co-benefit approach. So looking at areas where you can direct resources to initiatives that deliver not just climate, environment action, but also socio-economic equity. And you can do this through a well-defined taxonomy and budget tagging so that you can really identify the critical investment opportunities to mobilize significant domestic resources. And then for international finance, the onus is really on developed countries also to provide adequate financing flows to developing countries. And they are essential as catalytic financing that will ensure a transition to a low-carbon future that benefits the whole world. And in closing, the Secretary General has mandated UNDP to support countries to have a coordinated response, to come up with more, the next generation of national determined contributions, and we're looking forward to working with stakeholders to make this happen elsewhere and also in India. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Angela. I truly appreciate the way that one speaker's points segues very well into the next. And you ended, Angela, with the point about cooperation. And no one embodies that better than Hari. With your view on regional collaboration and cooperation and connectivity, maybe you could give us some perspective as to how you are viewing the energy transition and the work that you do at AIIB, wherever.
Thank you, Nikhil, and good afternoon, everybody. Honored to be here representing AIIB, Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, which is a multilateral development bank, a new kid on the block. We have been in existence since 2016. And we have, if you see the bank, Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, we have certain thematic priorities. They are that our project should have a climate co-benefit of at least 50% in all the operations. We have far exceeded that already. And there should be a strong element of private capital mobilization in all our financing, because we don't want to crowd out the private capital. All the MDBs are here to crowd in the private capital. We are also here to ensure cross-border connectivity that you spoke about, Nikhil. I'll come back to you in a minute on that, as to what we do for this cross-border collaboration and regional connectivity. Promoting energy transition, not just energy transition, but which is also just, like Angela was talking about. It should be just. It should also take care of all the socio-economic impact is very much part of AIIB's energy sector strategy. I would like to say a bit about what can multilateral development banks like us do in helping countries like India and other developing countries in bringing about this energy transition. Very quickly, I won't take much longer. So we can bring, of course, traditional project financing that we can do. And where we add more value is by providing policy-based financing support, which will help the governments to develop and implement policy and institutional reform programs with the objective of scaling up climate finance and to accelerate the energy transition. So we can be there right from the stage where the government is planning to formulate a policy, and we can be there until the project is financed. And where a new technology is being implemented, or an existing technology in one country is being implemented for the first time in another country, the sponsors, the financiers will see a lot of risk. Private capital sees a lot of risk. They would not like to go straight away into investing in those projects. That's where we as multilateral development banks come in to de-risk at the beginning, to tell the private sponsors that yes, we are there in the beginning, in the construction phase, in the initial phase, to de-risk the investments so that private capital can come in, which very well gels with our thematic priority of mobilizing private capital. These are the things that we can do. And what are the non-financial things that we can do while doing this? We ensure all the MDBs, I'm not just talking about AIIB, we ensure that all the projects that we finance are Paris Agreement aligned completely across sectors, not just in energy sector. They are Paris Agreement aligned. And we also ensure that while the energy transition is quite critical, the wider environmental and social issues are not overlooked. GHG abatement is one thing, but at the same time, we have to ensure that the transition is just, the environmental and the social impacts are well taken care of. In the projects financed by multilateral development banks, they are well taken care of. I'm sure they are well taken care of in other projects too, but we just go that extra mile to ensure that the wider social and environmental issues are not overlooked. That's something to do. And we also ensure that while we are talking about transition all the time, we don't forget to make the current infrastructure resilient to all the impacts of climate change. Adaptation is also equally important. Sometimes it could be overlooked in all our excitement on energy transition, renewable energy, but adaptation is something that we would like to look at to ensure that the current infrastructure is quite resilient. Coming to your point on regional cooperation, one of our mandates is to ensure that, is to promote regional cooperation and connectivity. And it's not just building roads and bridges across countries or across states. That's not the only connectivity we are talking about. International power trade, power transmission lines between countries, power trade from one country to another. So these are the things that we focus on. One example that I can give from AIIB Finance project is we recently closed the deal to finance a 600 megawatts wind power project in Lao PDR, which is completely going to export all the power to the power-hungry Vietnam. I mean, if this does not happen, probably Vietnam would have engaged more in using fossil fuels to generate this 600 megawatts. But Lao PDR has the capacity, but not the demand for the electricity. They are generating electricity and constructing transmission lines to provide this power to a neighboring country, Vietnam, and we are proud to be part of these programs. So this is what we mean by regional cooperation and connectivity. And one last word that I would like to say is, in energy transition, we talk about mitigation and adaptation. There are a lot of things happening in mitigation. Secretary spoke about renewable energy generation targets, which is quite impressive what India has achieved so far. There are new resources, green hydrogen. There are a lot of technologies being implemented in storage. We are doing a lot of things. We as a bank would also like to focus on some low-hanging fruits like improving the energy efficiency or reducing the transmission and distribution losses, because these things also contribute directly to energy efficiency. These things contribute directly to reduction of emissions, for example. So we are looking at, in some countries, in Bangladesh, for example, we are looking at how we can improve the energy efficiency of government-owned buildings. We are taking a sample size of about 300 to 400 buildings. These buildings have very old traditional heating, ventilation, and cooling systems, which are not that efficient. So we are looking at those buildings. We are looking at what we can do to improve the efficiency of the heating, ventilation and cooling systems in those buildings so that they consume less electricity, which is as important as generating new electricity using renewable resources. These are some of the areas that the bank is working on. We are working very closely with our peers, with the World Bank. We are doing a lot of co-financing together with the World Bank in all these areas. And we'll be very happy to talk about more. I see that the timer is up and we are already running late, Nikhil. But thank you for this opportunity. We'll be happy to take any questions. And I just would like to conclude saying that energy transition is something that's really important for the country. And we as a multilateral bank, we are behind in all these things. We would like to support completely. For example, India is not just the largest beneficiary of our loans. India is also owner of the bank. They are the second largest shareholder of the bank, owner of the bank. So we stand behind the country, we stand behind all the developing countries to make this energy transition just. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Hari. Ladies and gentlemen, we are running out of time, but I would very much like to take some questions from the audience, and I'd appreciate if we could take 2 or 3 of them together at the same time before we leave it to the audience and with their concluding remarks. So if we could just show some mics here to the front, and then we have some at the back, whoever. Yes, right here, please. No, please don't give comments. This question would be much appreciated if it could be concise.
Hi, good evening. I'm Rahul. I lead a think tank, Rice in a House. We specialize in foreign policy planning. My question would be to Secretary Singh. So we are seeing definitely energy transition is important. We are getting finance. We might be able to address the issue of equity and just transition. And definitely global cooperation is there. But what we need is being able to produce technologies, because green tech is important for India to be Atmanirbhar, especially when it comes to secure our energy security needs. What are some of your ministry's focal areas to ensure that India is capable of producing green technology in the near future? Thank you.
Thank you. I'm just going to take some more questions and then come back to the panel. If you could just give the mic back there, please. Yes, I'll take all 4 questions.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. This is Mayank from Addison Global. I mean, just one small comment. I mean, this has to be the most complete panel I've ever seen on this topic. So kudos to that, whoever organized the panel. Secondly, my question to Secretary Singh. What we work with is a number of clients, and like you mentioned, green hydrogen is one, area that we are focusing on. The issue that we see when we're dealing with the government is there are so many ministries, and you alluded to that as well. Is there a plan to have one an interministerial board or something specifically on climate change or on energy transition? That will be really helpful from the industry perspective as well.
Thank you. Yes, question to you.
Yes, my name is Vishal Sanghvi. I am running my R&D company last 25 years. Especially my question about the financing for energy transmission. Like some of the formula we have developed, which is used by consumer for the wind and solar actually, because sometimes
Could you
power
come to your
transmission.
question?
Yes. So when there is now we want to transfer a formula to the manufacturer companies. So how the finance is available where such kind of the validated products used by direct consumers, So that's my question is there.
In a new industry, how do you fund technological innovation?
Yeah.
I'm sorry, I'm going to take one last question with the gentleman here.
Hi, I'm Dr. Ashish Sharma. I'm founding CEO of Sustainability Alternatives in England. So for over a decade, I worked as a researcher across the continents on air pollution health impacts. So all of us are very much aware about the deteriorating and air quality in Delhi and other Indian cities also, which no one really talks about, the small cities in India. I'm just concerned about that we have ample knowledge and database and research which has already proven that coal-fired emissions are really carcinogenic. I mean, we don't need more research to add to that. And I mean, few weeks before, I attended almost all of your conferences. There was a summit on energy security where ministers from power sector, they were saying that coal is here to stay, right? And the COP29 was going on. So I'm not an activist, I'm a scientist, just a disclaimer. So I'm just wondering, many of you panelists I have seen at Vibrant Gujarat also, I understand that, developing countries are aspiring to, increase their livelihood and, the quality of life. And also, we don't have to
Do you have your question, please?
Just 1 second. We don't have to
just
fall
come to the
into
question,
the
please.
rat race of increasing per capita emissions. We can have some behavioral change initiatives. So my question is, we may not always rely on the foreign development grants. We need in-house systematic reforms. For example, we could have ESG mandates. So Michael pointed out about carbon trading scheme, and Surat has done a wonderful job. But unfortunately, we speak across the, with the urban local bodies across India, but then there is no really market, for sustainable startups or sustainability related and startups in India or green tech startups. And unless we have an ecosystem for that, I don't
just
think
would like to get through
we can achieve a
panelists
net
with the
zero
answer.
goal. Yeah,
Well, thank you very much. So I'd like to revert to the panel now for your final comments, as well as if you could cover some of the questions that have been asked by the audience. In case you don't have a direct answer to any of the questions, I would very much appreciate it if you could leave us with what you think are your priorities, immediate priorities, with short priorities going forward. So first, I'd like to start with the Secretary, Mr. P.K. Singh, and then I'll come to Michael and then August.
Nikhil, allow me to go in the reverse order of questions. I think the first one, the gentleman there raised about in-house financing, developing some kind of a mechanism to kind of reduce reliance on overseas funding is what you meant. Yes, you made a point because you see, if I just give you a basic stat, the way our banks are lending to the RE sector, that is an area of concern because if you see the overall lending ratio as compared to NBFCs, they lend 4 times more than the NBFCs in the overall perspective. But when it comes to RE sector, they just lend 0.25 times, 1/4 of what the NBFCs do. So one thing is that, yes, we need to push the banks more. Perhaps it is time to look at some kind of a renewable financing obligation on the banks. But this is a sector, this is rising, it makes a lot of economic sense. So come forward and support it. That's number one. Number two is we have institutions like, again, I'm going back to what I said of changing the mindset. Institutions like REC and PFC in the government sector, they are mostly financing power projects. I mean, they have always been financing power projects. The little mandate that they have to go outside power, they are probably, sponsoring some metro or some flyover. It is now perhaps time to, at least one of them should totally finance the RE sector. The third thing could be, within NBFCs also, there are challenges which we need to address. But then having said that, it is not only the global funds which are going to, domestic funds are going to see us through. We do need cheap financing from overseas as well. There are various avenues. People are there to do it. So I think why not get the best of both worlds? Coming to the question of the gentleman regarding, I think you asked about some common forum for addressing issues. You're very right. In case of green hydrogen in particular, there are different sectors which we need to address. There is shipping, there is steel, there is long-haul transport. All of these need to abate. Yes, we do have an overarching, what would I say? It's a green hydrogen mission that is under MNRE, wherein we are trying to define just the pathway. We are trying to say that, look, you need to improve. Let's do a pilot together. We are financing it through government support. Once the pilot comes through, we are going to go ahead. And also trying to develop some kind of demand for the manufacturers who come into play. All those things are happening, but the coordination is certainly there at our ministry level. To the last question, I think the first question on green tech. Yes, it's a very valid question, but then as I mentioned in the beginning, we don't need to reinvent the wheel. Some of it we do have, some of it we need to just adapt. I mean, there are people willing to help. And that's when I say that whole of government approach, say better a whole of world approach. I mean, we all need to realize it's a common goal. And the more we help each other, hold each other's hands, the easier the task will be for all of us. Let me also remind you that, the climate goals are not achieved, and not as in bold underline, till India decarbonizes. So we have to pay special attention to India. We have our development imperatives, but still we are trying to take that path. So I think on technology as well, we would expect as much collaboration as possible.
Thank you very much. I'm just going to get the last comments from all the panelists before we close the session. Over to you, Michael.
Yeah, so let me try to be quick in the interest of time. I outlined what I think is the global energy challenge. My view is that India is at the actual epicenter of the importance of this. Per capita energy consumption is too low. I think it's about 1,200 kilowatt hours per person per year. Air pollution is too high. The average person is losing about 3.5 years of life expectancy. And it's in the bullseye for climate change. So there are a lot of ways to get from here to there. And so that this exact panel is not being held 10 years from now, I really think there is that
time is short, and the best and tried and true way forward is to turn to markets to help to solve this, not to point to particular technologies, not to point to this particular mandate or that particular mandate, but to set goals and let markets achieve them. And that will require letting go of some of the engineering tendency of wanting to understand the exact technology. And there's now some real examples of markets working very effectively in India, and I encourage that so that we don't have the same panel in 10 years.
No, thank you. The outcome orientation is something that I fundamentally agree with. This space is too dynamic, it's changing too quickly, and something that regulation will only hold back. Angela, could I get any last comments from you, a sense of priorities that you may wish for us?
Yes, absolutely. First of all, I think I'd like to end by saying the example that's coming from Jharkhand is a really good example of looking at the future beyond coal. And what the task force has done is really rely on research that's context specific to come up with options. Because I strongly believe you need policy options based on research, but then they've also come up with a macro modeling tool to be able to see what the impact is of different options, but also going down to the people who are working in the industry, socioeconomic assessments, to find out what are the options, what are alternative livelihoods that need to be put in place. But finally, also coming up with the same language, being able to develop the capacity of policymakers so we have a common understanding on what a just energy transition means. So there's really room to have that exchange.
Thank you. Thank you. Ed, are you still with us? Hari, could I get your comments?
Thank you. Nothing much to add. Energy transition is here to happen. It's happening in a big way.
What's a one-word priority? Is it cooperation, connectivity? What do you think is?
It's cooperation. And I also think that we should, we see air pollution here, we see all that, but we should also focus on a lot of positives happening. There are quite a lot of positives happening. I just wanted to give you a small example. When I arrived last night in the airport, I wanted to take a cab to the hotel here. I came from Abu Dhabi, where I'm based. And the cab driver made me wait for 10 minutes. He said, no, sir, you can take only an EV, not a diesel vehicle. And I had to wait for 10 minutes to get an electric vehicle to come to the airport. I was so happy to wait for. That was the most productive wait that I've ever had. I was very happy to see that these things are happening. And I'm sure such things will continue to happen. And we as international financial institutions are ready to support all this. Thank you.
Thank you. Ed, would you have any last words or sense of priority for us?
Hello, sorry, yes. Just a couple of thoughts, if I might, just bouncing off some of the questions. The first on the gentleman who asked about coal. There is a paradox here, isn't there? Which is that every year solar output goes up more than expected, and it's one of the great success stories of this transition. But also every year coal output or coal production and the amount of coal we're burning, especially in China, goes up more than expected. And so it's tricky. I think they might be kind of interrelated, and we do need to talk about that. And the only other thing I would add is that one of your questioners asked about within India, so there are so many different ministries, each has a role within this transition. I would just spread that out and say, there's global coordination issue here. On this panel, we have excellent speakers from the World Bank, the UNDP, AIIB as well, and everyone plays a role within this energy transition conversation. But I think if you were standing, in 1944 and asking what is the global architecture that we need to deal with the current problem that we're facing, both with climate, but also with supply chains, to ensure how this is done cooperatively, to ensure that this doesn't result in trade wars, you might come up with, a different architecture with institutions that were designed to deal with what we've got right now. We don't have that, and I think that's problematic because there could be political challenges. As I said, we have lots of the technology, but there is a big political roller coaster, I think, that's going to come in the coming years as we work out that coordination, and we may have trade wars as a result of that.
Thank you, Ed. Collaboration is not only between governments, between industries for technology upgradation and innovation, but also possibly within ministries. And you've already did allude to it. There should be a hierarchy, in my opinion. But there's no one better to end this session than August. Could I get you to give us our last comments and possibly tell us your priorities as well?
Okay. Thank you very much, Harry. I would like to start with where the Secretary left, which is that, and also what Els just said. If we were to redesign our system today, it would probably be different because this is a whole of world issue. We need a whole of world approach. Good news is that the institutions, the global international institutions we have now are transforming themselves to be fit for purpose. We are investing a lot in adaptation, as you heard earlier. We also investing a lot in mitigation. We're actually making sure that at least half of what we spend, or close to half of what we spend, is on that. In fact, in my view, it should be almost 100%, because everything, as I said earlier, should be supporting energy transition. We're transforming ourselves. In India, the World Bank, we're spending some of our loans on forestry to provide livelihood to communities, to also increase the carbon sink. We're spending some of our loans on protecting coastal communities from the impact of climate change. And now on the energy transition itself, we have discussion on cooling industry to enhance energy efficiency. We are investing in renewable sector. I was in Rajasthan yesterday. We're talking about new solar parks in Rajasthan, as we did in Madhya Pradesh. We're investing in decarbonization of MSMEs so they can also contribute to the transition. AQM, air quality management, we have projects in the Indo-Gangetic Plains coming up in the various states from Haryana to UP and perhaps soon to Punjab, West Bengal and Bihar. We're also investing in the distribution grid and intrastate connectivity of the grid. So there is a lot that we're doing with the current institutions we have, and let's support this transition. The government is doing a lot. And my parting word is that if you think of energy transition happening in a country in a big way, you are in that country. It is India. As we heard earlier, India is investing a lot in renewable. The installed capacity is 40%, and it's going to increase. It increases every year. The ambitions are high, and they are achievable because India is already, operating this transition. The big question is there will be a need for additional financing, and where will that financing come from? And from my point of view, it will come from within. It will come from transforming the financial system to support the whole transition, because there isn't a lot of money that will come from elsewhere, frankly, because the Indian economy is so big that even what comes from outside will be very little. Finally, I would like to say that at the World Bank, we are also really investing a lot in stimulating private financing. The International Finance Corporation, I don't know whether they're in the room, IFC and MIGA, the Multilateral Investment Guarantee Agency, working a lot to stimulate private financing. We have achieved quite a bit already in this area, and we'll do a lot more. And within the public financing side of the World Bank, we're reducing the cost of energy, our loan to energy transition, through the Livable Planet Funds, which has just been approved by our board, so that when countries like India borrow for energy transition, the cost of the loan can be reduced. So thank you very much for this panel, and I think I feel very energized with this, the conversation today, and we'll continue supporting the transition in India. Thank you. Thank you, Harry.
Thank you, panelists. May I now request Mr. Soni to present a token of appreciation to all the speakers. May I now request Ms. Soma Banerjee, Deputy Director General CII, to present a token of our appreciation to Mr. Soni, please. We would request all the speakers to step forward for a photo opportunity. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. With this, we come to a close of this session. However, we are starting the next session. Markers of Viksit Bharat at the rate 2047 and beating the middle income trap. Please stay with us. We're starting the session shortly. We'll request all the participants to take your seats, please. We're starting the session. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Naushad Forbes, Shri Saurabh Garg, Dr. Indermeet Gill. May I now request Dr. Forbes to take over the conversation, please. Thank you.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to this session on Viksit Bharat and the middle income trap. We're very fortunate today to have Dr. Indermeet Gill with us, who has recently authored a report for the World Bank, the World Development Report. That's an annual publication, and this is the 2024 edition. And Mr. Saurav Garg, Dr. Saurav Garg, who is the Secretary in the Ministry of Statistics and Program Implementation. When I first came across this year's World Development Report, it was not yet available in physical form in India. So I needed to start reading it in an online version. And then the physical version finally showed up about 8 weeks ago. And I'm still of an age where I need something physical if I have to read something that's longer than about 100 pages. So this is, I really commend that everyone read the report because it is very rich in data. The basic thesis is a relatively simple and straightforward thesis that says that as countries develop and as they wish to make the transition to being higher income countries, they need to move from a focus on investment to a focus on investment plus infusion of technology and the diffusion of that technology within the country to later on a focus on investment plus infusion plus innovation. And that basic concept is powerful in itself, but what makes the report so valuable are the many case studies and the granular data that it provides on countries that have made the transition very successfully, and also examples of places where countries have struggled with that growth transition. There was a second reaction that I had when I read the report, and I was just mentioning this when we were meeting before the session, which was if we apply this concept and say the middle income trap to India, that do we need to worry about a middle income trap in India? My response was, I hope we are so lucky. And the reason my response was, I hope we are so lucky, is because our development model has been somewhat different to that of many countries that have become middle income countries. Middle income countries have generally got there by investments in low-wage, labor-intensive manufacturing. And the middle income trap comes from the struggle that countries have to transition to a higher income level, and therefore higher wages, which makes them less competitive in precisely the things that gives them their current income status. And that's why you need to then move to the next stage of innovation. That really is where we are not. We are at the stage at $2,500 per capita GDP of a lower middle income country. We are at the stage where much of that $2,500 comes from a service sector economy and an economy that's quite capital and skill intensive, certainly for our level of development. So I really look forward to hearing Indermit, to hearing Saurav's comments after that, and then we'll open it up for questions. Thank you very much. Over to you, Indermit. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Naushad. I have a few slides that I wanted to show you, but there you go. There are the slides. I don't know if there's do I have a clicker or do I just say next slide? Yeah? Okay. So next slide, please. I'm supposed to have a clicker, is it? Thank you very much. So I have lots of slides, but I'm not going to talk about all of them. So here's what I'm basically going to show you. The first one is I'm going to give you a quick overview of the world economy. And essentially what's happening is that you're seeing slowing growth, you're seeing widening gaps between poor countries and the rich countries, and also between some of the rich countries and the middle income economies. And what you're also seeing is you're also seeing that the next 10 years are likely to be much more risky than the last 10, which were less risky, which actually were more risky than the decade before that. Right? The second part I'll actually show you, and this is based on the World Development Report, about the problems that middle-income countries have faced over the last 3 or 4 decades. And essentially there are 3 parts. The first part is that middle-income countries tend to grow slower. You tend to sort of, there's a higher likelihood of slowdowns in middle income as compared to low income or high income. The second one is that a large part of growing through middle income is really about structural change. And a lot of these countries tend to have a hard time doing that. And then the third one is looking ahead. Actually, it turns out that the middle income countries of the past, like South Korea, like China and others, had it better than India would. Okay. Both because of things at home as well as because of things abroad. Then I'll actually talk about the main features of the Indian economy. And this is based much more on a general assessment of what middle-income economies look like. Essentially, the main thing that actually distinguishes middle-income countries as compared to high-income economies is, of course, that they have less capital. They have less physical capital, financial capital, infrastructure capital. But that's not nearly as important as the fact that they are much more inefficient in the use of capital, in the use of talent, and in the use of energy. And so then I'll actually talk with you about what we propose in the World Bank report, which is essentially based on Schumpeterian creative destruction. We try to sort of see how does one make an economy more efficient, right? And those are the 3 things. The first one is one has to discipline incumbents. The second one is to reward merit. And then the third one is to capitalize on crises, because a large part of growth through middle income is to try to change the institutions, try to change the structures and so on. And crises are when the forces of preservation are the weakest. Right? And then finally, I'll say a few things about what are the priorities for Viksit Bharat. And I would have to say that the things I'll say to you are things that you probably know of and so on. I just find that based on what I used to think about what was happening in India as compared to what I think now after looking at this report, I feel like these changes are not happening quickly enough. So I feel like time is of the essence. And so it means that these structural changes have to happen much faster than they're happening. Okay. All right. So I'll quickly sort of go over what is happening in the global economy. For advanced economies, the big problem is secular stagnation. So because of demographic issues, because of sluggish productivity growth, these economies are facing the same kind of things that Alvin Hansen talked about in the 1930s, and then Larry Summers actually talked about 5 or 6 years ago, before the COVID crisis. If you look at emerging markets, as I said, outside of Central Europe and outside of East Asia, there has not been that much catch-up. You'll be surprised by the numbers that we found. And then in the case of the low-income countries, things are the worst, actually, because we actually find that for low-income economies, depending on how you measure them, about the world's poorest 25 countries that are low-income, less than about $1,200, or the 75 countries that are eligible for concessional assistance from the World Bank, you sort of look at them, they're falling behind. Again, these are countries mostly in Africa, but not just. Okay, so let me show you a few charts. But just for you to know, we have these sort of 4 categories of countries. You have low-income countries, about 25 of them. You have low middle-income countries, about 50 of them. And then you have upper middle-income countries, another 50. And then you have high-income countries, another 50, about 45, 50. And what you sort of see over here is that in terms of the population, the most important countries are middle-income economies. So India classifies as a lower middle-income country. China classifies as an upper middle-income country. The most important high-income economies, of course, the United States. And perhaps the most important low economy are countries like Ethiopia and others, right? And what you sort of see is that these countries are very, very important because, both because these countries have a fairly big share of the population, they have a growing share of the GDP, they already have a very high share of CO2 emissions, and they still actually have quite a few poor people. I'm talking about the middle-income countries now. Okay, if you look very, very roughly speaking, and if you look at potential growth rates, what you sort of see is that if you look at the first decade of the 2000s, the second decade, and the third decade, you see that world economic growth, the potential growth rate, actually even lower, is closer to 2. If you look at advanced economies, you actually sort of see that that has actually fallen by half. And this is largely because of growth in Europe has fallen by half. And if you look at the emerging markets and developing countries, you see that the growth rates, the potential growth rates have gone from 6% to 5% to 4%. So the overall, you see a slowing down of growth in the world. And this is the environment in which India is supposed to grow fast and get to high income. If you look at the poorest countries, of course, as you see, they're actually falling behind. Okay? But these are not countries that that I'll talk about again in these slides. I'll be talking about the middle-income countries. Okay. And the last bit, like I said, was that the risks are multiplying. So if I had showed you this chart about 5 or 6 years ago, there would be fewer such risks, but now you sort of see this geopolitical tensions, conflict, trade fragmentation, heightened policy uncertainty, because you don't know what the US is going to do, for example. And then higher for longer interest rates because you find that inflation has been far more persistent in these countries, far more stubborn. You have more frequent natural disasters, and especially the low-income countries have a really hard time dealing with these. And then, as I said, weaker than expected growth. So here are the facts, though, for middle-income countries. Like I said, the first one is growth slowdowns. So they're 3 times more likely than advanced economies to hit a growth slowdown, however you define it. I mean, we define it in a very particular way. We also find, of course, that these slowdowns tend to be sooner and more severe when certain levels of institutional quality are controlled for. Right? The second part, like I said, is that these countries have less capital, they have less talent, and less natural resources, actually, or exploitable natural resources than rich countries, but what really distinguishes them is their efficiency. They tend to be very inefficient economies. And then finally, like I said, they have growing headwinds, demography and debt at home, and fragmentation and conflict abroad. By the way, India is a bit of an exception in the sense that actually India is pretty good when it comes to demography. In fact, India is at peak potential right now in terms of demography, in terms of dependency ratios and things like that. Indian debt, public debt, is getting to a worrying level, but private debt is not. Then if you look at fragmentation, of course, there are some advantages that India has as a large economy and as an alternative to China. So Indian growth, by the way, you always hear this, that Indian growth should be lower because the external environment is not good. And the answer to that is yes, but not nearly as much as it is for the typical middle-income country as compared to India. India has it much better than others. Okay, so what's the aspiration of the typical middle-income country? I think that the best way to summarize it is that here's a quote from Deng Xiaoping, who was asked, why is it that a communist country was trying to get rich? And he said, well, to get rich is glorious, okay? And everybody should get rich. So there's no reason why middle-income countries like India shouldn't get rich either. Now, if you then look at, you say, well, what's happening? What's the facts around this? And take a look at that blue line there. That blue line, take a look at that blue line exactly. It's the middle-income countries excluding China, right? And take a look at the numbers for 1980 and look at the numbers for 2022. And there isn't any change. That's the first thing that strikes you, right? I mean, these countries are about, in dollar terms, about 5% that of US per capita incomes. This is US per capita income, not the typical, not the typical middle-income country. The typical middle-income country, but not the typical high-income country, right? It's just the US, which is the world leader in this case. And you sort of see that hasn't changed that much. It went up a bit and then it's come down, in fact. Okay? If you look at China, of course, because of China, these countries, it looks like they've gone from about 4% of GDP, 4% of US per capita income to about 8% of US per capita income. It's doubled, but without China, it has actually not changed at all. So it's not that easy to get rich. Okay? Now, then when you look at the numbers and say, well, how many economies got rich? You have about 34 countries that became high income from middle income, that went from middle income to high income during the last 34 years. And that's not a bad thing, right? But then when you start to look at two things, the first one is, what were the circumstances of these countries? The first one, of course, is that if you look at the circumstances, some of them just found oil, and they timed their reforms to coincide with high commodity prices. So that's the Saudi Arabias and so on. Then you've got another group of countries, the largest group of countries perhaps, is the European Union. Okay, these are countries that are actually integrated into the EU, and they got the benefit of big markets, and they got the benefit of capital flows in the right direction. Okay? Because they were signaling what their institutions were going to look like 10, 20, 30 years from now. They would look just like the Germanys and the Frances and the Swedens and so on, and as a result, they got a lot of capital, long-term capital, FDI-like capital. And then, of course, you got the other countries, and out of the other countries, the countries that actually stand out really are South Korea and Argentina, which goes in and out of high income. By the way, next year, if I show you a chart, maybe Argentina won't be high income anymore. Okay. All right. No. I'm sorry. So Argentina is actually out already. That's Uruguay, which actually does stay in there. Okay. But these are very small economies, by the way. They're often island economies or countries like Uruguay and Chile and so on, right? Small economies. If you add up all of these, they don't add up to the population of Pakistan. Okay? So this is just like as if Pakistan had become a high-income country over the last 34 years, it would be the equivalent of this. So that's the net sum achievement of the world. Pakistan became high income. Now, I know that you guys won't be happy with that, but I think that if you see the sum total of the achievement, it isn't that much. Now, here's a chart that actually has exercised Indians a lot, because when we did this very crude arithmetic, we plugged everything into a growth model, and we said, how long would it take for India to get, or how long would it take these countries to get to a quarter of US per capita income? Quarter, okay? And you sort of see over there, you have the Polands and so on. Of course, Poland is already, so Poland is already more than a quarter of US per capita income. So that green line is how long it would take for Poland to get to half of US per capita income. But then if you look at Indonesia and India, you sort of see that it would take 75 years for these two economies to get to a quarter of US per capita income. By the way, a quarter of US per capita income is not bad. If you look at it today, it would be around $20,000, $21,000. Okay? So that's well into what we would call a high-income economy in the World Bank. A high-income economy in the World Bank is anything above 15,000. It's a very frugal definition of high income. And so everybody sort of looks at this and says, oh, it's going to take 75 years to get to Viksit Bharat. But we are talking about the next 22 years, not the next 75 years in which we are trying to get to Viksit Bharat. And the answer, of course, is this is a good debate to have, but you need to specify the thresholds and all pretty well. And we try to sort of do that at the end. I'll show you a few slides. Okay. So like I said over here, much slower growth when you get to higher income. So this is the likelihood of growth slowdowns. They are about 40% when you get to a per capita income of between 5 and 25%. Of US per capita incomes. That's around the place where middle income countries are. High income countries are generally about 25% to about 100% of US per capita income. And you sort of see over there that the likelihood of growth slowdown, growth may come down, but the likelihood of a sudden decline in growth is actually much higher in middle income as compared to high income economies. And here's the other chart. This is a chart that you should really think about carefully. This is GDP per worker relative to US GDP per worker, right? And if you sort of look at this, that's a red line there, right? So, and then what we calculated was we did our best estimates of physical and human capital and infrastructure capital and so on, and try to sort of see what share does the typical middle income country have as a share of the US, okay? And that's roughly 2/3. So basically what this chart is saying is that if the US, if the typical middle income country were as efficient as that of the US, it would have a per capita income that would be close to 70% that of the US. Okay? So it would be more than $50,000. In fact, it is less than 21%. Okay? It's less than, in fact, it's less than a quarter, right? That gap, of that 50 percentage point gap, is in a sense the crudest measure of the inefficiency of the typical middle income economy. The inefficiency with which it combines capital and labor and talent and energy. Okay? That's how much more inefficient it is. You can call this productivity or total factor productivity or whatever. I think the best term for this is just efficiency. Okay. Now, the last point I wanted to sort of say was, so these countries have had, they have a greater likelihood of slowing down. They appear to have a tough time improving their structures and making them more efficient. And now there's a third strike against them. What's happening is that if you sort of see, richer economies are now more protectionist, and actually that has resulted in countries like India and others also becoming more protectionist. Okay? Brazil, India, China, and others are also quite protectionist. All the countries above that line tend to be relatively more protectionist than the others. And if you look at the ones above the line, they tend to be the G20 economies. So the culprits for protectionism is not just the United States, it's also the Indias and the other G20 countries. Okay? So these are large economies. So that's about what? About 30, 40 countries there, right? Including the EU and so on. Then you've got another 150 countries. So just think of those 150 countries. These are smaller economies, the smaller developing economies usually. And these economies tend to require a less fragmented international environment, they're the ones who are going to have a really hard time. The other thing, of course, is that we have record levels of debt in the advanced economies, in emerging markets, as well as in low-income countries. So for both these reasons, things are not going to look as good in the future for these countries as they are. So that's the setting in which India is trying to get to high income. This is not the ideal time, in a sense, to try to sort of do this. Korea had a great time. Even China, actually, from 2000 to 2018 or so, actually had a great, and China made the most of it. By the way, China's growth rates were much higher than what India's are right now, when China was at this, when China was at the same per capita income level as India, right? Okay. So here's a chart that I want to sort of say is that, is really about these sort of three things. The first one is capital use. And I think a big problem here is that unproductive firms tend to stay in business, and less productive firms tend not to leave, or they tend not to have to shut down as much as they do as compared to, let's say, the US. The second one is talent allocation, and I think the biggest inefficiency here is that women are kept out of rewarding work. So in the sense, the economy is not very good at allocating talent to task. Okay? And then the third thing is that while there's a lot of obsession about renewable energy and so on, actually the big problem is energy efficiency. Okay? And so energy to output ratios, emissions to energy units and so on are very, very high in India. That's the problem that India really has. Shouldn't be about trying to sort of get people to buy electricity generated by renewables, by solar and so on. It should actually be just try to sort of make sure that energy inputs per output unit are brought down through efficiency, okay? Whatever that means. Oops. Okay. So inefficient use of capital. I'll just show you a few slides on this one. So this is basically the age of firms on this side and the employment relative to firms that are less than 5 years of age. So if you look at the lowest line there, that is India. And if you sort of see over there, the age of firms, as a firm gets older, it doesn't get any bigger as compared to a firm that is just starting out. The top line there is the US. Okay? And you see over there that the firms that stick around tend to be 7 times the size of a new firm, 7 times. What this actually also means is that there are a lot of firms that shut down and free up the capital, free up the talent, that the firms that are growing, the firms that are more productive, the firms that are adding more value, those firms then actually get to use. And it's very important for a middle-income country to do it because there's not that much capital, there's not that much talent, energy is expensive. So you don't want low productivity, low value-added firms to stick around. Okay? Same thing. Okay. And here's, if you sort of see the second chart over there, that's what the share of small firms is as you look across the age of the firms and so on. And if you look at the US, you see what a big drop there is. It's the same thing. Okay, that's the first. The second one is, if you look at this, I'm sorry, this chart is a bit complicated, but what it really shows is that the share of women in professional occupations is very low, is artificially low in India. Okay? So fewer than 3 women work in professional and managerial occupations for every 10 men. Okay? And if you look at the reasons for this, there are 100 reasons for them, but whatever it is, with this level of inefficiency, you cannot expect to be Viksit Bharat by 2047. Okay? This is very, very inefficient. Okay? So it's grossly inefficient use of talent. Okay? Because, both because what happens essentially is that when you hit the levels of income where India is right now, what happens is that the demand for skills actually increases pretty much exponentially. Okay? And if you just rely on accumulating more skills, which is educating more men, it's not going to work. You have to start to use the stocks much better. It can't just be about the flows. Okay. And by the way, the same thing is true in the case of energy. If you sort of look at the typical middle-income country, you actually find that they are about, the GHG emissions are about 3.5 times higher in a middle-income country as compared to a high-income country. And if you look at the energy intensity, it's about 2.5 times higher. Okay? So you don't look at this per person, because that's the thing that we are used to looking at. I'm talking about per unit of output, right? Okay. So here's the case in the case of India. India is about 25% more energy intensive, and this is an energy deficit country, right? And you actually see that both energy intensity as well as GHG emissions intensity in India is higher than the typical high-income economy. And by the way, typical high-income economies have access to much more energy than India does. So here's just a chart that actually tries to sort of look at that thing that I showed you in average. Now I'm showing this to you as a thing. And if India were just half as efficient as the US, we would be Viksit Bharat already. Okay. All right. So how does one actually avoid this trap? So the first thing that we learned after we looked at these things carefully, because we were talking about a middle-income trap, it turns out there are actually two traps, okay? And I'll show you why. The second one, then we try to sort of say, okay, how does one get out of this? And then we found that the best place to look was actually Schumpeterian growth theories for a very simple reason. If you look at Schumpeter's original book, it's called Capitalism, Socialism, and Democracy, okay? And so you're talking about economic, you're talking about social aspects, and you're talking about political aspects too. So we feel like these theories actually give you a lot more insights that are useful for middle-income countries, because it's the interaction of the political and the economic and the social that's very, very important. Okay? And then we come to the sort of the three sort of things that we distilled from there is basically what we said was essentially what countries like India have to do is to not vilify incumbents, large firms and so on, but to somehow to find ways to discipline them, because the incumbents are as important for innovation, for not just innovation, but also the infusion of technologies from abroad, and also for investment. Big firms are very, very important. In fact, India has a deficit of big firms. So one shouldn't be vilifying big firms, one should be wanting more firms to be big. The second one is you have to reward merit, regardless of whether or not that merit is imbued in female human capital, or the human capital of backward groups, or the human capital of discriminated minorities. It doesn't matter where. You have to find ways to allocate talent to task. Okay? And then finally, like I said, the time to do this is during crises, when a firm that is not behaving particularly well is the large incumbent is actually in trouble. That's the time to make sure that you discipline that incumbent, because those are the times in which the balance of power shifts, right? And this is based on the experience of countries like India, of course, but also countries like South Korea and others that have gone on to become high-income countries. But the main point is this, like, all right, that growth strategies that served countries well when they were low-income economies, that is basically when you're a low-income country, just investment was an important thing. Investment in human capital, investment in physical capital, and so on, because these countries don't have. So it's a relatively simple strategy. But when you get to a point where the contribution of investment actually by itself, or factor accumulation, declines, and the importance of productivity goes up, you need to shift strategies. And what we say over there is, the main thing that we say is you have to first make that shift from investment to investment, plus bringing in new technologies. Why? Why do you want to bring in new technologies? Because like I said, these economies are inefficient. But there are other countries that have figured out how to become more efficient. So you need to learn from them and bring in those technologies. It's not enough to import them. It's also important to diffuse them across. Like, for example, the kind of things that India did in terms of digital technologies. Perfect example of doing that, right? It should be done in everything. And then finally, as you get closer and closer to the frontier, you actually find that it becomes very important for you to start to invest in innovation, because you have to figure out things by yourself now you have gotten your economy to a point where the rewards to learning from others actually diminishes. It becomes harder and harder to become more efficient just by learning from others. You have to figure some of these things out. And this is just a summary of that. We try to map it very, very crudely to whether or not how these strategies map to those income levels. Low income, mostly investment. Low middle income, investment plus infusion. India is right in the middle of the low income stage. And then upper middle income, which is where China is now, the thing is that you should be. Now, this is not a hard and fast thing, but this is basically where the thrust of policies ought to be. And I think this is really, I think one of the weaknesses of India, perhaps, is that it's not paying enough attention to have deliberate infusion of new technologies from abroad, not just in digital technologies, but in every darn thing, right? Okay. And if you sort of look at the strategy there, by the way, it's another term from Deng Xiaoping when he was asked to explain what is China's strategy. China's strategy is reform and opening up. Not just one of those things, not just reforms alone, but reform as well as opening up. You have to do both. And good practitioners of those countries are South Korea, Poland, Chile, and others. South Korea is the best practitioner. South Korea is easily the most remarkable development story of the last 50 years, maybe the last 100. Okay. And I won't take you through this, but basically what you actually found was in the case of South Korea, they actually had, the way that the South Korean government actually deliberately gave incentives to firms like Samsung to go and get technologies from abroad. In that case, it was Japan. And that's a team that actually was visiting NEC, right? But then what happened was NEC quickly found out that these guys were actually starting to make things better than them. So they stopped licensing their technology. And as a result of it, actually what happened was that South Korea switched to infusion subsidies. I'm sorry, it just skips over to this one. But it started to switch from infusion subsidies to innovation subsidies when NEC started to push back. Now, here's an example of a country that didn't do particularly well, which essentially was Brazil. What it ended up doing was it ended up saying, once it got to middle income, it basically said, okay, you know what, we're going to erect walls and we're going to invest a lot in R&D. We're going to invest in innovation. The GDP per worker for Brazil was about 40% that of the US back in 80 or so, right? And over time, as you sort of see, Brazil has actually lost ground, right? And then if you look at, so during the same time, if you look at Korea, you see it starts out at about half the productivity level as a share of US productivity as a thing, and then you sort of see it going, it's actually closer to 62% now. So then what we do is that we try to, I think I'm running out of time, right? So we try to sort of look at the implications for Schumpeterian growth theory. And by the way, Schumpeterian growth theory has evolved since Schumpeter. And so we try to sort of look at the Schumpeterian original, the next one, which is Aguillon and Howitt, and then after that, another round. And each one is somewhat different. And each one actually is more applicable to one thing or the other. So the first round was actually very applicable to what's happening in the energy sector in most developing economies, which is dominated by the state. And then if you look at the talent part, it looks like that in enterprise actually looks a lot like Indian enterprise today in the sense that incumbents as well as entrants actually often work together. Okay, let's skip this. Viksit Bharat now, what would it take? So the first thing that we sort of say is, look, we require shifts in the way we think about these things. We are very obsessed with superficial qualities of firms, like the firm size, firm age, and so on. What we should be caring about a lot more is value added. We are very obsessed with things like income inequality. But if you think about income inequality, that's not particularly highly correlated with the inefficiency of allocating female human capital to tasks. Okay? What we should be looking at much more are things like socioeconomic mobility, and you can disaggregate that by gender and so on. we actually do think about socioeconomic mobility as a problem, but we tend to sort of finger income inequality because firm size data are much more available than value-added data. Income inequality numbers are much more available than socioeconomic mobility data. And the sources of energy, that data are much more available than renewable, than actually looking at emissions intensity and so on. So one of the things that Saurabh's group has to do is to make sure that the private sector is not flying blind. It should be actually, that it should be supplying, or it should be encouraging the collection and the release of data, timely data, so that the private sector, so that households and others can make decisions based on this. Okay? All right, so here are the shifts that are needed. From firm size to value added, from inequality to socioeconomic mobility, from sources of energy to things. I could just stop over here and I could, so I can share the slides with you, but the rest of the slides, we try to sort of look at Indian data and we see, is it that incumbents are very bad? And we find the answer is absolutely not. Sometimes, for example, in the case of Geo 4G, Geo towers and so on, without this, you could not have had the digital revolution. Then if you look, again, if you look at, so here are firms like TCS and Infosys and others, and you sort of see that they actually do invest young. Even when they're young, they actually invested a lot in R&D to become market leaders. And then we try to sort of look to see how much of a bang do you get if you remove some of these distortions that actually keep firms small. So all of these are in the case of India, by the way. And then in the case of this, there's just one chart I wanted to show you, Naushad, and then I'll stop. Sometimes we talk about things like firms and so on, and we think that that's where most of the gains will come from. So here is a study that was done by 5 people. This is not done at the World Bank, but what they looked at was how much of the GDP of the US today can you attribute to the reduction of labor market discrimination for women and minorities since the 1970s? Okay? And by the way, that ratio is between 20 and 40% of US GDP today. So if you look, for example, in the 1970s, 94% of doctors and lawyers were white men. Today, that ratio is less than half that. Okay? So those kind of transformations you can actually look at this. Now, we try to sort of do the same thing for India, by the way, and then as a result of that, we try to sort of come up with these numbers here. Here, right? Sorry. There. Okay? And we sort of say, okay, you know, we actually try to attribute some of these same reforms and similar rates of returns to these reforms and say, if you do all of that stuff, if you can get to Viksit Bharat by 2046. But even when India gets to high income at that point, you have to remember that it'll still have a per capita income that would be less than 20%, less than a fifth of that of the US. So there's a lot of inefficiency that needs to be covered. So I think that the 2 or 3 things that we did want to say were right over here. I'm sorry, I'll just go back to the last, to my first slide once again, and then I'll stop, which is sorry. I thought that I had the summary slide, but I don't. So according to me, at least, and this is not something that's in the report because we don't get into specifics by country, but if you sort of look at the priorities, I would say it would be economic freedom, which would include things like openness to trade and so on, equal opportunity, especially for women, but also for minorities, education quality. I think education quality in the case of the US is, or education quality in the case of India is a huge priority. And then the last one would be energy efficiency. When I read the debates in India, they're all about vertical things. Should you invest in services, or should you invest in manufacturing, or should you invest in agribusiness? These are very horizontal things. And then if you look at India's record, India is actually very good at horizontal stuff. Okay, like for example, infrastructure, push in infrastructure. India is very good at that. If you look at India, the push in the digitalization of the economy, again a horizontal thing, it's very good at that. If you look at tax reform, again a horizontal thing, it's very good at that. If India is so good at those things, why is India thinking about trying to sort of go vertical now? India should actually just stay horizontal and just do all of this. I shut up now. Thank you.
Thank you, Indiabet. Thank you. And thank you also for the offer to circulate the slides. We would love to do that, especially because the slides on India would be of great interest, I think, for people to look at in detail. So thank you. Let me go to Dr. Saurav Garg. Saurav, great to have you with us. We look forward to your comments, and then we may have time for one question. So, yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Naushad. And thank you, Andirmeet. I think you made my job simpler because in the last part of your presentation, you answered how India can become a Viksit Bharat by 2047. And I think the challenges and risks that you mentioned, I think are something that are well recognized. And in fact, if you look at it, the focus has been on how to ensure that we can take care of the pitfalls that lie ahead. I'll just focus on a few of the issues and give some of the examples of what's being done. Not to say that what the challenges are in any case less important. But just one thing which I would want to mention, you mentioned about how over the past 50 years, the middle income has been the same at around 4 to 5% of the American income levels. But if you look at it more in terms of the absolute, and if you look at what India was, let's say 50 years back, and where we are, we have universal access to electricity now. We have universal access to drinking water, 80% are tap coverage. We have universal access to banking facilities, which was not there, through correspondent banks. We have universal access to sanitation, 12 crore toilets under this. We have universal access to clean fuel, the kind of 10 crore or more LPG cylinders. And the poverty that we had 50 years back, even though it might still be at 5% of the US GDP, we are now at single digits at any kind of multidimensional poverty index. The Gini coefficient, we are in fact reducing the Gini coefficient if you look at it. So the inequalities are reducing. So one is obviously we need to look at it in a relative manner, but we need to be assured that what is the actual absolute changes that are happening. And it is precisely because of, I think, the kind of work that the World Bank and your researchers are doing is the kind of focus that you see on the roadmap for the Viksit Bharat 2047. And what does it mean? We're talking of a GER, the gross enrollment ratio, in which primary education, we are already at 100%. We're talking of the higher education, which is around 30%, to rise to by 50% by 2035, which is what the new education policy is talking about. And as a corollary to that is the fact that the focus on skills, which is what the WDR focuses a lot on in terms of talent when you talk about. And I won't go into the individual programs or the initiatives, but I think the fact remains that whether you call the Pradhan Mantri Kaushal Vikas Yojana, or you look at even the PM internships program, which has just started recently, the focus is there that the demographic profile, which is attractive to us, we are able to harness it more effectively. Female labor participation rate is something which is actively engaging, I think, all policymakers. And if you look at the kind of interventions that have been done, and if you see the changes, About less than 10 years back, it was somewhere around 18, 19%. We have reached nearly 40%. In 10 years, it's doubled. And that's the focus that you have in the recent budget. You had focus on working women's hostels, you had focuses on creches, you had amendments to the Maternity Benefits Act, and a host of other areas on safety of women to ensure that female labor participation, which you very rightly mentioned as one of the areas, that's a major focus. I don't know, land as a factor you probably mentioned, but we must realize that we have now 95% of the land is computerized in terms of the land records. And that's the first step. And why I'm saying the first step? Because the digital DPI, which has become so prevalent, the first step was ensuring that everyone has Aadhaar. I'm slightly partial to Aadhaar, having been CEO of UIDAI, but the fact remains that the digital transformation that we are seeing today is over a period of 10 to 12 years. 2009 is the first Aadhaar, and we are into 2024. And we are talking of UPI, we are talking of DigiLocker, we are talking of BharatNet and DigiYatra and broadband access. And why we are able to do it is because of the building blocks having been there. And it is in that context I would also mention that the focus on innovation, which is in terms of, for example, last year was the first year that we crossed 1 lakh patents in any 1 year. And I think that's a very big, good harbinger for future. There are 1,580 global capability centers now in India operating, which is again the focus of innovation and infusion of technology. So I really don't want to talk about all the measures, but there are 2 or 3 things which I would just mention what has already been done to telescope the time taken internationally or what the middle income countries you were mentioned. First is on banking access, that we had universal access to bank accounts in a period of 7 years, where globally that has been traditionally, I think it's 40 or 48 years, I'm forgetting the exact number. So we could do it in 7 years. The second I would want to also mention, which was there, that how do you take care of incumbents? I think all of us are aware about even a decade back of the state electricity boards. I think all of them have been dismantled, and you have private in terms of distribution and transmission that there is. And in energy, for example, green hydrogen, there's a green hydrogen mission which talks of 5 million MT per annum by 2030. So the point I'm just trying to say, it's good to be aware of what are the pitfalls of the journey ahead, but I think it's equally necessary to be aware of what we are capable of doing, as long as there is a clear focus, a clear path, and the forward-looking vision is there. Just one, you talked of investment, infusion, and innovation. One which I suppose underlines all of this is institutions, which is very necessary. And I think you mentioned somewhere on the regulatory changes that are required. And I would just like to highlight some over the past few decades that we've had. We didn't have a real estate regulator. We have now. We didn't have the insolvency and bankruptcy code, which is still improving, and I think there have been a lot of changes, but it's there. We didn't have the GST as a system. It's there. We didn't have an International Financial Services Centers Authority. It is there. We didn't have a pension fund regulatory authority. We didn't have an insurance regulatory authority. And we didn't have a competition commission. So these are the institutional changes, and I think these are extremely important building blocks for ensuring that we reach a middle income status from where we are. And I think I'm sure that there are 2 ways of looking at it. I'm looking at the glass being half full, but I'm very optimistic of the kind of changes that we are capable of and have shown if you look at the kind of changes that we have done. And I just gave you a few examples of that. And you mentioned that we have to maintain that balance between creation, preservation, and destruction. And I think we in India are very used to that balance between Brahma, Vishnu, and Shiva. So I'm sure it's not something we'll not be able to do. We know that this is there. But I think what is equally important is to have a strong diaspora like you who keep bringing what needs to be done. And I think that's the strength collectively of both people living within the country and outside. And I'm sure 10, 20 years later when we sit down, we'll be remarking on I hope we'll be remarking on how we have been able to achieve this. And why I say that, I think just to add, I met Indermeet for the first time more than 20 years back. In 2008, Indermeet was doing the WDR on economic geography. I'm meeting him again, 25 years later, on a WDR of middle income. And I'm sure the WDR on economic geography has shown how India was able to tackle the challenges of economic geography. And I hope both of us are there 25 years later to talk of how India handled the challenges of a middle-income country. Thank you. Thank you for inviting me.
Thank you very much, Saurav, and thank you also for pointing out that Indermeet is part of the infusion that is recommended. Okay, we will take just one. Okay, we'll take two questions since there were two very. Rishi first, and then at the back there, please. Yeah. And request is please a question, not a comment.
I have a very pointed question. Yeah. So you said that there should be an emphasis on horizontal rather than vertical, but one thing driving the productivity numbers is your industry or product mix. So I'm just wondering, particularly when you look at the PLI scheme, it's trying to change the mix, which also has an impact on the productivity numbers, just not age and size and so on. So would you have any comment on that?
Okay, and we'll take the second question, and then I'll come to both Indermeet and Saurav. Yeah.
Sir, I'm serial innovators. I want to validate my sparking ideas which come out from the discussion, like middle class income by saving their energy cost, saving healthcare costs, saving education cost. So what kind of programs and solution can offer by creating some yearly based event, timely based event, and corporate, SME, MSME, increase the productivity through technology, and also sometimes we can create the, allow the employee to do, my company earlier employee do 8 hours job, but now using the technology, their work is reduced to 4 hours. So can you allow the employee to work part-time, like, they work 4 hours here, 4 hours other company. So can we, as a, this question both to collaborate with Mr. Gill and Gaur, because I have something idea from your PowerPoint, and sir, we start something like, yearly based event program, where, how, currently if we see about, we release the movie.
So
but,
the question, the question is,
yes.
the question is, can we
use
event technology? Can we
create a yearly event, like, how the Swachh Bharat Abhiyan, technology adoption by MSME actually, if there is an entire movement we created, then people will get affected, how the infusion and innovation.
Okay. Go first.
No, I think that the general thing that we've learned is that there's been a lot of work that is being done in the world that includes countries like India and so on, where they're using newer methods to answer some of the questions that I was talking about. But the thing that these new theories are actually much more demanding about high quality data. So that's the thing I wanted to tell Saurabh, is that India's data quality is seen as not improving quickly enough as compared to the complexity of its economy. So I think that's a very, very important part, because you want to, because what happens is that poor data actually leads to really bad policies. Good theory is much better than poor data. So if you have poor data, then you just stick with the theories. Now, the second point on this one about productivity-linked incentives and so on, you're right. I think it's a step in the right direction. But once again, you need to make sure that you look at the value-added effects of these things. And right now, I think India is failing that. You know, India can't even agree on, we don't even agree on what our female labor force participation is. You don't have those debates. You don't see those kind of debates in the US and so on, where people are arguing about female labor force participation rates. Or in China even, it's supposed to be 68.7. And people agree on that. Here, I get one, sometimes I say, you know, it's 18, somebody else is saying it's 21, somebody is saying it's 42, you know? So I think we need to agree on these things. Now, the other thing is that the way that we are using these definitions, it's very important to actually try to sort of see what policy discussion are you trying to inform with those numbers? If you're including unpaid family work and so on, is that really addressing the issue about allocation of talent to task of women? Maybe it is, I don't know. You know, but those are the sort of, I mean, you have to look at the policy question first and then say, are we supplying the data for that? Are we doing it in a timely way, a transparent way, and so on? I know this is a difficult thing to do, Saurabh. I know it is difficult. But I think for a more complex economy like India, it is absolutely essential.
Two things. I'll respond to Indermeet's comment on the data, but just to say that no doubt that flexibility on labors, like you mentioned about the working hours and gig workers, I think is an example of that. In fact, the Maternity Benefits Act amendment allows work from home for women, keeping that in view. And on productivity linked, I just can't agree more than what you've mentioned. But just to talk about data, because that's something that in the Ministry of Statistics, that's what we produce. I think there was a concern about delays being there in the data, but I think we've taken care of the kind of, now we are in a position to release within 90 days any survey data that is done. We have the PLFS, the labor force data, which is out, we put it out on the portals, and it's for everyone to see and comment about it, and we'll be very happy to discuss if there are any issues around that. I think the depth and the width of the surveys that we do, whether it's in terms of the CPI inflation numbers, whether it's the employment or unemployment numbers, whether it's the GDP growth numbers, I think credibility of the data that we bring out, I would think that I've had discussions with a lot of forecasters, with a lot of economists, and we keep having these data user conferences to get feedback on what is it that you feel that where our data can be improved, and what is the new data gap that is required and we would like to fill. In fact, I would like to take this forum to invite from industry. For example, we do an annual survey of industries, which gives a lot of feedback on the kind of products that are made, what is the geographical distribution, what is the labor force, what are the skill levels. And we had a interaction with 73 of the odd industry associations just to inform them about this. So we would be very happy to get feedback from industry if they feel that there is some data gap which would help them to make decisions. And the data that we put out is anonymized. So it's across about 100,000 industries we poll and get the annual survey of industries. In a couple of weeks, we'll have the annual survey of the unincorporated sector enterprises, where more than 4 lakh enterprises across the country, we survey them and put out the data which helps. So I think data is a major focus of the government, and that's entirely the focus of my ministry and we'll be very happy to engage in a dialogue to ensure that the accuracy, the credibility, and the robustness of the data that we are bringing out is so much clearer. Absolutely.
I just want to quickly respond. One second, Rashid, sorry. You know, the thing is, so as an Indian living abroad, I am very, very grateful to both the Indian government as well as Indian entrepreneurs for doing so many things that have resulted in every Indian being much more respected and listened to abroad. You know, because earlier I would go to some country and I would tell them to do something and they would look at me, where are you from? and I'm from India, they would, think, they would not say usually, but they would think, oh, go back to India and fix the problems back home. They don't think like that anymore. I do agree. The problem sort of, again, is, when you look at these things and you sort of say, how difficult is it for countries like India to actually get to high income? And then you come back home and you sort of say, okay, let me take a look to see whether or not, how quickly is India improving its economic freedom index? And you don't see that improvement. Or it's there, but it's not, it's relatively slow. Then you look at Vietnam, and you say, Vietnam is doing it so much more quickly. And as a result, it's taking a big share of this pie that is supposed to be coming to countries like India and all also. So it's not so much about, I completely agree with you, lots of good things being done, just not adequately, I think it's just the pace of it. So without trying to sound too impatient or too ungrateful, that's what it is.
So we could obviously continue this for some time, but we're completely out of time. But by the way, on the data, we'll talk, because I think GST data, properly anonymized, could be hugely rich and real time almost, in terms of,
I can just tell you, we are working on that.
Great, because that will be so powerful. And by the way, it's something that we will then have knowledge of the Indian economy, which very few other economies will have. Like the US it will not be able to do it, because you'll have value added at geographically, by product group. Almost, you can cut it almost any way, and
Sorry to add, but what we are working on is getting to a state. We bring out GDP at the national level, we bring out GSDP, the state level. What we are working on, how to bring district DDP.
Yeah, exactly.
So that's the level of granularity.
It'll be fabulous. Yeah, thank you. So, all that remains for me to do is to say thank you very much to both Indermit and Saurav for being here, for your comments, for your very rich presentation. We will happily circulate the presentation. So just give Amita, who's sitting there, or anyone that you see from CI, your card, and we'll get you the presentation. Yeah? We really appreciate your being with us, really appreciate your presence as well, and your great interest. I'm sorry we didn't have much more time for discussion. Next time we'll allow 2 hours for the session. Thank you very much.
Thank you, panelists. May I now request Dr. Forbes to present a token of our appreciation to the speakers, please. We would request the speakers to step forward for a photo opportunity as well, please. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. With this, we will close this session. However, please join us for the last session at the Darbar Hall,